So we're recording this on November 9th, Monday, just as we get back from the weekend when Joe Biden has been declared the president-elect by the media, and we're waiting for all that to become official. But it's a fortuitous moment, I think, to talk about China policy because we now have President Biden coming back in after a 4-year hiatus to deal with China again. And a lot has happened in those 4 years. He was one of the point people for dealing with China under President Obama and has had interactions with Xi Jinping himself. And he was part of an administration that began a pivot to Asia to ramp up military forces in the East Asian region to deal with what they saw to be the biggest long-term potential threat to the United States. But even with that background, the previous administration was still betting pretty heavily on engagement. They believed that to solve problems in North Korea, the climate crisis, and other things, they needed to work with China and hoped that by working with China, they could advance the common goals of the two countries as well. So much has happened during the Trump's 4 years, and we now seem to be having more of a emerging consensus in Washington, D.C. at least, that China represents a real threat to the United States and that we may need to do more than we have been to contain its military activities and its potential economic challenge. So we have today two experts, one from Washington, one from Hong Kong, who are going to talk with us about how they see the challenge posed by China's growing power and their ideas for how best to deal with this challenge. We hope that by hearing both their perspectives, we'll have some of the competing information perhaps that will help us think about what the new incoming Biden administration is going to do as it thinks about this most important foreign policy decision that they're going to be making. So I'm going to start my questioning with Scott Harold from the Rand Institution, and I'll introduce in a moment when I turn to Professor Reyes, Al Reyes from Hong Kong University. So let me start with Scott. He earned his PhD from Columbia and is a senior political scientist who has been with the Rand Corporation in Washington since 2008, specializing in the foreign and defense policies of China, Japan, the Koreas, and Taiwan. He teaches at Georgetown University's Security Studies program, Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, and is taught also at the George Washington University. He is currently a member of the Mike and Maureen Mansfield Foundation's program known as the U.S.-Japan Network for the Future. I serve as an advisor for that program and have had an opportunity to get to know Scott and his work over the last couple of years as he's joined the most recent cohort of that program. So Scott, we often hear these days that there is a consensus in Washington spanning both parties that China has become an assertive challenger to our security and economic interests in East Asia. We hear about its military activities in the seas north and south of Taiwan and about the disputed, around the disputed islands. We hear about its cyber probes, its efforts to dominate the next generation technologies, especially 5G telecom and artificial intelligence, and about the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you tell us which of these activities worry you the most and why?
Well, thank you very much, Len, and it's a pleasure to see you again, Al, and to have this opportunity to talk with your students at UVA, Len. And thank you for your leadership of the Mike and Maureen Mansfield program too. I think that it probably is a bit of a mistake to think that there's one of these that is the most worrying. I think many of them are very concerning. For different groups, they will be more or less concerning. So obviously, for the people of Taiwan or those who worry about strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific, the possibility of a cross-strait armed conflict between China and Taiwan that could drag in the United States, that would almost certainly also involve Japan, that would evolve into potentially something approaching a general war or conflagration that would potentially be even characterizable as a third world war or at least a conflict of that magnitude. I mean, I think that's enough to wake anybody up on a Monday morning. But China also poses a much lower escalatory but longer term persistent strategic threat in areas like its cyber-enabled espionage against defense industrial, but also commercial enterprises, certainly also targeting overseas communities of influencers, certainly attacking and trying to intimidate overseas ethnic Chinese communities, including those expatriate communities of Tibetans, Uyghurs, Falun Gong practitioners, and others who have sought to flee China. And its efforts to build a digital Silk Road through its exports of 5G technology and backbone architectures for information technologies like with Huawei, pose a long-term risk to privacy and individual liberty around the world, attempting, in other words, to offer poorer countries, countries that have less developed infrastructure, or countries that are just simply more price sensitive and less attuned to the risks posed by digital autonomy or digital security, a risk that, hey, you know, for this real cheap price, we'll build you a fairly functional telecommunications network that happens to be capable of and likely to siphon all of your information, all your users' information off through Beijing. So I mean, I think the question here is, are you someone who is more worried about short-term, potentially high risk, but perhaps lower likelihood conflict, or are you worried about the long-term threat to human security and human liberty that China's regime poses through its persistent efforts to shape global norms, institutions, and information technology architectures in the service of the Chinese Communist Party's hold on power? You know, frankly, it's very hard to adjudicate between the two of those, and I'm not even certain why we adjudicate between the two of those. I think that policymakers in DC, as best as I can tell, are attuned to both of them and recognize that we can and must both walk and chew gum. In other words, deal with short-term immediate deterrence, but also compete on that longer-term trajectory where the free world offers up technology solutions, infrastructure plans, and opportunities that can be competitive with China's without sacrificing our basic freedoms.
So let me follow up with one of the things you mentioned. You characterized the military threat in the region as a potentially grave but low probability threat at the moment. I'm wondering how you reconcile that relatively perhaps optimistic view with some of the news we hear about war games and simulations that have shown that the Chinese could dominate the space around Taiwan in the short term in a conflict there, and the words coming out of Beijing that suggest that President Xi has a strong intention to reunite Taiwan during his tenure.
Thanks for that, Al, and for that, Len. And I should say, without intending to cast any kind of to characterize the extent of how risky are we right now, I do think that there is a very serious challenge in the Indo-Pacific, in the security domain, especially around Taiwan, but also, of course, including the Senkakus and the Spratly Islands, where much weaker actors in the South China Sea, a much more powerful actor around the Senkakus, but in unoccupied territory, in that there are no people living on the Senkakus. All of those are very serious risks. And so while what I was trying to point at was kind of a more immediate versus a longer term, I do think you're right. I probably said probably lower. I think that it is probably correct to say that the likelihood that Huawei technology and China's 5G infrastructure build out will continue to spread to some extent is probably more likely than a war with Taiwan. And that's all that I meant. Now, I will say, there are a few things to say about a possible cross-strait conflict. One is that long-term Chinese strategic cultural trends have always emphasized the goal of winning without fighting. and engaging in heavy amounts of deception and intimidation and psychological warfare. So China, while it has not held Taiwan since 1895, and while the 24 million people of Taiwan have developed a very different identity and a willingness to stand up to China and to resist the one country, two systems approach that China has used and then abused in Hong Kong, nonetheless, I think China is trying to suggest that it has an unlimited appetite or ambitions for Taiwan that cannot be put off, and that the only possible recourse for the people of Taiwan is to submit and get a better deal by doing so. That has been Beijing's playbook since the late 1970s, early 1980s, when Taiwan lost diplomatic recognition and the alliance with the United States. With that said, since the early 1990s, the PLA has been receiving very large investments every year to build up the capabilities, to stand at close to parity with the United States, to build asymmetric capabilities to complicate US intervention in a Taiwan Strait scenario, and to deter and, if necessary, impose costs on Taiwan if it seeks to declare independence via a de jure change of its name and a request for other countries to recognize it. Taiwan has not said it's going to do that. In fact, under the current administration and all previous Taiwan administrations, what they have said is the Republic of China is an independent sovereign country and has been since 1912. There is no question of declaring independence. We are independent and we've always have been independent. With that said, the Chinese leadership could conceivably decide that either their capabilities have grown to the point where they have more confidence, or the likelihood of a US intervention, perhaps now during a period of some degree of questions surrounding whether or not the president is going to concede and prepare the transfer of office peacefully to his successor, could conceivably come as a kind of once in a lifetime opportunity that the Chinese leadership decided to take. Working to Taiwan's advantage is the fact that they have been prepared for this attack for 70, prepared for this attack for 70 years. Amphibious assaults and airborne assaults are extremely difficult. The defenders usually have a very large advantage, and China has fairly limited lift capabilities, both by air and by maritime vector. So China could certainly impose some very serious costs. Its leadership could decide to roll the dice on Taiwan. But I think there's also a narrative inside of the PLA that says, look, every year we get stronger. Every year our advantage over Taiwan grows. And Xi Jinping has been in charge of China for 8 years now. Does he have to have Taiwan in order to continue to be the leader of China next year? Probably not. No Chinese leader has had Taiwan since 1949, and they all were the leader the next year, as long as they didn't step down or die. None of them were overthrown for failing to achieve the conquest of Taiwan. So I think there's very good reasons to think, there is a lot of saber rattling. There's a lot of desire to look tough. There's a big desire to try to intimidate Taiwan. It's not by any means anything that someone should rule out by a wave of the hand and say they'll never do it. But is it likely? Are we at a 50% plus likelihood right now that China is going to attack Taiwan? I think not, because there are very good reasons to think that China's capabilities to attack Taiwan are still less than what they would need, and they could suffer a catastrophic loss of substantial portions of their surface fleet, substantial portions of their air fleet, and then also the enormous economic consequences that would come from a worldwide effort to compel China to stop immediately and then to punish it for what it had done. And that's frankly, something that right after trying to recover from COVID, I'm not sure the Chinese Communist Party wants to roll the dice in that big of a way. We all have to speculate. Of course, the people, I should point this way, the people this way, meaning, to my left, it would be, 4 or 5 miles is the Central Intelligence Agency. They and their compatriots up at the National Security Agency are, I'm sure, trying to gather every shred of evidence to divine the intents and capabilities at all times of the Chinese Communist Party leadership and the PLA. But do we see signs that, Xi Jinping has decided already that now is the time? I think not. And if you've read Ian Easton, one of the authors of a major look at whether or not China could attack Taiwan, Ian has been quoted recently in the media saying, look, one of the factors that will shape that is the water conditions in the Taiwan Strait, which are very, very choppy from kind of, if I remember correctly, it's, September to March. And so, if you've got 6 or 8 or 10-foot swells, that's a lot of up and down. And to be in those vessels trying to carry out a forced entry amphibious assault would be a major challenge. So, maybe we've gotten lucky, and despite the fact that this moment of potential questioning about U.S. resolve and capability during this political transition in the United States happens at a time when the weather conditions, something that has affected other Asian invasions in history. We can think of, Japan's attack on Korea back in the, 16th century, Len, something like that. These are real factors for military planners, and we may have gotten lucky that the weather seems to be particularly unfavorable at a time when perhaps Beijing might either calculate correctly that the US is distracted or miscalculate and then get us into a conflict. But right now, looks like probably just a lot of saber rattling.
Well, I don't know how reassured I am that we get to wait to March, perhaps, for the things to come to a head. But given the uncertainty in Washington today, I'll take anything I can get. So before I turn to our next speaker, Professor Alejandro Reyes, let me begin by introducing him. He has been an associate professor at the University of Hong Kong since 2007, except for the period between 2017 and 19, when he was senior policy advisor to the Assistant Deputy Minister for Asia Pacific at Global Affairs Canada. That is the foreign ministry in Canada, managing policy planning for the region during his tenure there. He had previously served in the department in 2002 as a senior policy advisor on G8 affairs to the Canadian Foreign Minister. He is now Director of Knowledge Dissemination at Asia Global Institute, a think tank at Hong Kong University. Prior to working in academia and government, Professor Reyes was a journalist for Asia Week magazine based in Hong Kong and Singapore, and then an independent consultant mainly to international organizations. I think the job title used to be called the Sherpas, who help organize these meetings. So he was one of those. He was born in the Philippines, and I got to know Professor Reyes when he and I studied together at Oxford in the 1980s. So Al, you've gotten to hear Scott's take on the current level of military and strategic threat posed by China. And I'm wondering whether you agree with the way he characterized things or would put it any differently.
Thank you very much, Len. Always nice to see you. And thank you, Scott, for it's nice to see you again after so many years. I just wanted to, before I start, just wanted to preface a few things. So I'm actually on leave from the Canadian government, but I'm not in any way speaking for the Canadian government or expressing any views speaking on behalf of the Canadian government. And then the second thing is, since we are likely to talk about, well, we already have talked about Huawei and cybersecurity and things like that. I just want to make clear that when I was an independent consultant, I had 3 contracts with Huawei. I did 3 things for them. And I'm always happy to discuss what those things are for matters of transparency. We just want everybody to know that. I am speaking essentially for myself, and I'm not speaking for anybody else, including the institute where I belong. Knowledge dissemination sounds like I'm a propagandist, but I assure you I'm not. But anyway, yeah, no, I think the mere fact that we're talking about military preparedness in case something should happen in the Taiwan Straits shows where we are in terms of the environment across the Pacific between the United States and China, in the Taiwan Strait. Yes, I would agree that there is this view. In fact, nowadays people refer to the situation between the United States and China as a new Cold War, right? And many people now, I mean, in some of the papers that I publish, some of the authors already just make the assumption that we are in this new Cold War. I think that there are some basic differences between the Cold War, between the United States and the Soviet Union, but you know that's the language that's being used. And also Graham Allison's Thucydides trap theory, this idea that there's some inevitability of some kind of conflict between the incumbent power and the rising power, the usurping power, if you will, seems to be on many people's minds. A lot of discussion about that as well. Is there inevitability to conflict between the United States and China? So as someone who, you know, I can't say I know China all that well. I've been living here in Hong Kong on and off for 32 years. And I've lived in the United States a long time. I do think that there has been indeed a shift in perception, and largely I think it has to do with shifts in the United States as well as shifts in China. A lot of people focus on this idea that China has reemerged, that there's now a greater sense of confidence, that you have a stronger leader in Xi Jinping, the strongest leader since Mao. That's what often how he's characterized, and that inevitably you have a kind of more assertive foreign policy, a more assertive military. I mean, these are allegations, and they're, I would say, borne out by what we've seen. If you think about the wolf warrior diplomacy that certainly Canada has been subject to with the Meng Wanzhou case, the Huawei case, the arrest of the two Michaels, the war of words has certainly been has brought the temperatures up. But I would also argue that the United States, shifts in the United States have also been responsible for this heightened tension. And part of it has to do with a lot of the politics that we've seen over the last 4 years, and that have been brought out by this election where there's growing inequality. And what does that generate? That generates a leadership that often is looking for enemies to blame. And we've seen it with Trump, where the Muslim ban and build the wall, all of this, that kind of rhetoric. And the war with China, the trade war with China is illustrative of that. It was seen, particularly by many in this part of the world, as a containment strategy, a strategy born of this increasing lack of confidence in the United States, in the competitiveness of the economy, and viewing China not just as a strategic threat, but in fact, possibly more importantly, as an economic threat, a threat particularly in the technology sector, the all-important technology sector of the future. Now, are we at a point where they might in fact break out from the kind of status quo that we've seen, the kind, into a possible hot war? I would generally agree that because we're talking about it more, there is greater risk. And because the United States, both and China, have been sort of playing a bit of chicken, particularly in the South China Sea, to assert, in China's case, what it sees as its sovereignty over the area delineated by those 9 dashes, and the United States assertion of the freedom of navigation, particularly with its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. concept, then yes, I think certainly the risks are heightened. But I think we have to be very careful about focusing so much on those issues, particularly when we think about the many years where there has been essentially whatever you might, and I would agree, there's a greater intimidation nowadays of Taiwan from the mainland, but I think that's in large part due to the current government in Taipei, which is essentially a pro-independence government. If you go back just a few years to the Kuomintang government under Ma Ying-jeou, the predecessor of Tsai Ing-wen, the situation was far less fraught. So I'm not saying that we're out of any dangers particular, but the idea that we're right now talking about possible imminent invasion or amphibious assault or something like that, I think I would argue is somewhat alarmist. But that said, I would agree that there is in China a more strenuous leadership. There is in China, in mainland China, dreams about fulfilling the reunification goal, the goal of reunification. And a magic date in many people's calendars is 2049, which would be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And that's not too far away from now. So, and of course, the situation here in Hong Kong has not instilled much confidence that the mainland will be all that restrained. I agree that there are now greater challenges in the region. I do think, though, that we have to understand that China as a re-emerging power, a power that will inevitably rival the United States, that inevitably will become the world's biggest economy, and I'm not talking about droit de seigneur or anything like that, because they're so big and so powerful that they must become the lords of the manor, as it were, or the feudal lords of the region. But I'm just saying that there are the United States, and also I don't want to indulge in whataboutism, which I try to refrain. But the United States is not unknown for the United States to exercise a lot of what they object as to what China is doing. That particularly when you think about espionage, spying, or what have you, if we go by Edward Snowden, the one country that actually has documented evidence of an incredible network of espionage to the granular level is the United States. Again, I would just argue for saying, yes, we're in a more fraught time, but we need to be very sensible and very measured about understanding exactly what the threats are, what the risks are. And also, and we'll talk about this, the solution is not to shut things down and to decouple.
Thank you, Al. So we've heard from you, I think appropriately, that some of the responsibility for the growing tension in the region has to be borne by the United States because we have taken steps to increase our military forces in the region as well. And we've engaged in other activities that we complain about in China's case. But let me turn to Scott and see what he thinks about the response that the United States has taken so far, because even though this may have contributed to the tension, there are plenty of people in Washington who think that what we've done so far on the military side is not enough.
Well, thank you, Len. And Al's initial comments remind me that I should make equally clear I'm speaking exclusively as an individual observer. I'm not speaking for the Rand Corporation, certainly not the US government, not any political campaign, not my wife, not my kids, just me. So, and I think, Len, the goal of this discussion, as you framed it, is really to help your wonderful students at UVA. And so I think this Al's reaction to my comments and what he's said may give us a chance to really kind of pull apart or tease apart areas of difference and things that students should be alert to. So I will now, if I may, but in the course of trying to answer your question, also react to some of the things that Professor Reyes has said and kind of give how I think those are seen in different circles. So one thing that that Al mentioned, he said, I think he was critical of the notion that some have put forward that the United States and China might be entering a new Cold War. That language is not exclusively coming from the United States. There are certainly some elsewhere who have projected that or who see that. But I would say offering up a perspective as seen from within China, I've long believed that the Chinese Communist Party, and in particular the PLA, disbelieved the notion that the old Cold War was ever over. Let's remember, China was a party to the original Cold War, if we will. The Chinese government never thought that the United States government had stopped trying to topple the Chinese Communist Party and China's control over the mainland after 1989, 1991. So for them, the Cold War between Washington and Moscow may have ended. But certainly many of the programs intended to encourage the growth of the rule of law, to support civil society in China, to cause China to have the rise of a middle class were seen, and to help spread the internet and internet technologies that might empower people to have control over information that was not censored or controlled and sent to them by the Chinese Communist Party were all seen as threats. And I can remember US administrations saying, China's accession to the WTO will help lead to a middle class. Bringing China into all of the international forums in the world will help China evolve towards global standards. That's language the Chinese Communist Party feels threatened by. If you remember back to the early part of the last decade, Jane Perlez at the New York Times reported on a PLA video called Silent Contest that talked about how the PLA, or at least some within the PLA, viewed the United States as waging a covert war to try to topple China. You'll remember, of course, your students should know about and probably do know that many in China believe that the color revolutions of the early part of this century and the Arab revolt and the Arab spring of the start of the last decade were seen as having had some secret CIA hand behind them. And indeed, document number 9 that was issued under Xi Jinping, if I'm remembering the exact date, I think it's something like early 2013. It identifies lawyers, religious groups, civil society activists, and others as kind of the enemies who are foreign, the black hands overseas, or the hostile foreign powers are conspiring with to try to bring down our government or our party. So I think that for China, or at least for certainly influential forces within the Chinese Communist Party, the Cold War never ended, but it was a very nice fiction to convince Americans and the rest of the world that China was not at war with them, or that China did not see them as a threat. Not an outright, we're shooting at you war, but a competition that ultimately will decide the fate of kind of the survival of the Chinese Communist Party and its influence on the world stage. One of the factors that I think has shaped many people in the United States' view of the Xi Jinping administration is the fact that it is committing genocide in Xinjiang. It is committing crimes against humanity in Tibet. It is taking the organs of living Falun Gong practitioners. It is suppressing language speakers in Inner Mongolia and forcing them to teach their children in Mandarin. I was in Hong Kong at the time when the Speak Putonghua campaign went all over Guangdong province, and more speakers of Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, have been coming into Hong Kong, and that has created problems with the ethnic identity issue in Hong Kong. I will also clue your students in, Len. Al mentioned this very prominent book by Professor Graham Allison, The Thucydides Trap, which has been very widely criticized in the China security field. The central contention of that book is that, that a rising power and a great power that's established will inevitably clash. And that is in many ways a very favorable narrative if you're sitting in Beijing. It puts the onus essentially on Washington. Why won't the United States simply let us rise? I think the critique of the Thucydides trap is really what many in the United States having a problem with China's behavior is not the growth of Chinese power, but rather how it is used, the interests it is linked to, the regime that is exercising that power. Finally, close out. I think the question about how do we regard what's happening in the East and South China Sea, Professor Reyes very correctly, I think, said, we see a much more assertive China. Partly that's because of Xi Jinping's personality, but it predates Xi Jinping's personal rise to power. In the 2008, 2009, 10, 11 timeframe, when Xi Jinping was not yet in charge, we already saw China being more assertive. And so I think it's fair to say that as China has described the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea's rulings as a mere scrap of paper, a piece of garbage, rulings that invalidated the notion that the 9-dash line has any legitimacy, rulings that clearly stated that no feature in the South China Sea, not even Ituaba, the island occupied by Taiwan, is a real existing island that generates an exclusive economic zone. In that sense, for China to position itself against those rulings is really to reject the entirety of international law. And if the United States has done that in the past or on other issues, then it should be condemned. But for sure, when China does this and tries to privatize a body of water that is the critical link between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, that is the historical fishing areas of 6 or 7 different countries, Vietnam, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and Taiwan, the rest of the world should and has and will continue, I believe, to speak out and say, no, that's not your water. Yes, you have access rights to it, but so do other countries. And if the international legal system is to mean anything, if we're not simply to exist in an era where might makes right, then countries that have interests and a voice should, and I think have and probably will continue to speak up.
So Scott, can I press you on, now that you've taken a pretty strong position there on what the status of the waters in the South China Sea should be? Do you think the United States is taking a strong enough position in terms of using its military power to make sure that fishermen from all these countries have access to all this water? Or should it be doing more than just asserting the right of the military? I'm not saying that's all it's doing, but a primary message the US has been sending is that our military has a right to transit through these waters, and that we have officially said we have no view on which country has a stronger claim to the territorial, the islands in the South China Sea.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Len, you're correct, and I'm glad you're pressing me on this because I didn't fully really answer your question. First, I would say I don't think that the United States has primarily been using military force. For the United States has been conducting what are called freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs. FONOPs are the use of military platforms for diplomatic signaling purposes, meaning, in other words, you say this feature is mine, you can't come within such a distance of it. And if we don't contest that, you will then be able to say we have acceded to that. So we are going to sail closer than you say we are allowed to. We're not firing on you, we're not threatening you, we're not pointing our weapons at you or lighting you up with our fire control radar. We are simply saying, you told us we have to abide by this, we will not abide by this, but we're not going to sink your ships or shell your facilities. I think it's also important to say, Len, and I know in this context it can be a little less clear, so let me be very explicit. The United States is not doing this to protect the claims of fishermen from the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, or elsewhere. The United States is doing this to protect the principle that international law defines these as international waters, and international waters are open for any country to use for transit, for shipping, even for military transit. What we have said is that we do not believe that China can privatize this body of water, and that international disputes should be adjudicated under international law and through existing international institutions. That's what the Philippines did by filing a lawsuit at the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. Vietnam, unfortunately, to date, has not formally filed its own suit, but certainly benefited from the brief victory of the Philippines, but then didn't choose to take that challenge up with China directly, which has meant it's largely one of the weakest countries in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, now currently led by a very authoritarian president whose focus is primarily on extrajudicial murder of accused drug users or drug pushers, and so who is not interested in really facing China down over this issue of the claims that the Philippines has that China is trying to privatize. That has meant that in some ways this has fallen largely to the United States as an issue of principle, but it's an issue of principle that also has real world consequences for US national security and for the security and stability of the region. So just to connect it up to some of those, if China were able to say no country can enter this body of water with its military for any reason without our permission, then China could treat the entire South China Sea as what in military speak would be termed kind of a bastion or a safe area for its nuclear submarines to operate from. That would give them the capacity to threaten countries from just 12 nautical miles off their shore, or even potentially to locate their future nuclear launch submarines, meaning submarines that can launch ballistic missiles carrying nuclear weapons towards US features like Guam or the US state of Hawaii or US allies in the region. And so while there are issues of history, there are issues of fish, there are issues of oil and gas resources on the ocean floor, there are also very real issues of national security. And of course, there is a fifth issue here, which is international law as a principle. And I think that all of those combined together give the United States a very strong stake in trying to marshal allies and partners around the region to stand up and say, look, China, we're not saying we're taking this from you. We're saying there's a set of rules. It's fair for everyone. You have to play by them too. If a court rules that your claims are not supported by evidence, then you are under the same obligation as anyone else to abide by that ruling.
So Al, Scott has raised a lot of points to which you might want to respond, but let me direct you perhaps towards his emphasis on why the US military needs to be in the South China Sea to stand up for the principle of international law and the fact that, I can't say the fact, the argument that the South China Sea is a vital transit lane for all of the countries of East Asia that needs to be free and open, so that all countries can take advantage of it. So I want to see whether you agree that there is a role for the US military to play in standing up for that principle, and start to get used talking also about economic strategies. So do you think the US has overemphasized military approaches to standing up to China on these types of issues, or should it use in more creatively economic strategies for discouraging China from its assertive military posture?
I think you focus very much on this idea that it's not so much China as much as the leadership of the Communist Party of China, that there is this track record of concern, that we should be so concerned, whether it's evidence of ethnic cleansing or what have you. And then also, as I say, Canada, from our perspective, we've been on the receiving end of all of that tough talk and wolf warrior diplomacy. Now, the United States has, in the last couple of years, I think, or maybe even less than that, has been focusing on referring not just to Chinese or to China and the transgressions of China or the Chinese. No, the Trump administration was very careful, and I think this is certainly under Mike Pompeo's leadership of state and the influence of his chief China advisor, Miles Yu, that to refer to the Chinese Communist Party with the idea that, and I think they've been very open about this, that the United States would like to try to drive, in some ways, a wedge between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. Now, whether that's a possibility, I mean, that's up to the United States to have that kind of strategy. I would make a point that the surveys, not just by Chinese people, but by reputable scholars, do suggest, however, that the Chinese leadership is actually quite popular in China itself. Now, whether you believe surveys or polls in China, I mean, I think that one can make an argument that China, and I know this is made often, and again, should not excuse any violations of human rights or what have you, but from the perspective of many people in this part of the world, that China has brought more than 500 million people. I think now it's, they want to eliminate poverty, I guess, by the end of the year, end of next year. The fact that they have lifted all these people out of poverty, it makes you cry. It should make you cry with joy that this has happened. I have had many, many students in the, how many years have I been teaching now? 11, 12 years teaching here in Hong Kong. From the mainland, many, many who are not, these are not princelings, these are not privileged young people. These are young people who for the first time have been able to go to university, who for the first time have been able to leave their country to come and study whatever they wish, whether it's something practical, quote unquote practical, like business or law or what have you, or something that parents might view as less practical, like the arts or English or whatever. They're doing it. Journalism, but it's something that should be admired. It's something that we should say, well, okay, again, I'm not saying that this justifies whatever harshness of the system, but we have to be balanced. We have to really think about, what has the Chinese Communist Party done in the past, in the years since it's been in power, and certainly since China started opening up. Now, again, I don't want to be, and I have been labeled by many people when I bring these things up as an apologist for the Communist Party of China, and in no way do I want to say that we should somehow absolve the rulers of China because they've done this, they've managed to bring all these people out of poverty. But it's the same thing with any other country trying to emerge. I mean, sorry, I'm all over the place because I had all sorts of.
If you don't mind, I'm going to try to focus you for
okay.
Where I'm hoping the conversation will go. What I don't hear you apologizing for the Communist Party. What I hear is you're trying to explain to us why it's very unlikely that however hard the United States tries to drive a wedge between the Chinese people and the Communist Party, it's very unlikely that strategy is going to succeed because so many people within China see some benefits from that the regime has brought to them. And if I'm reading you correctly in that you are taking that kind of a position, and that even the previous strategy of hoping that increasing the size of the middle class would eventually lead to a gradual democratization of the regime is probably far-fetched. I think you also probably believe that. So short of those kinds of strategies, is there something the United States and its allies should be doing that would be more of a engagement strategy that could nudge China away from its attempt to be so assertive in its military activity in the region.
Yeah, can I just make a couple of points in response to that? We keep on focusing now on what is it that China wants, right? And we keep on asking, well, what do they want? Well, we also have to, I think we have to maybe rephrase that question a bit and understand, well, China has a huge number of problems in its development. I mean, it is not this somehow unitary juggernaut that is rising in a linear fashion and is just ready to take over from the United States once it becomes the world's biggest economy. It has huge internal problems, economic, social, and as we know, geopolitical problems. And the issue here is not, in many ways, it's not so much what does China want, is we have to start thinking, well, why do they behave the way they do? What do they need? And if you think about the concern about the South China Sea in that respect, then you can think, well, China, like any country of its size that needs the food and the energy that it needs, wants to be able to have freedom of navigation, but for its supplies, so that it can get the energy and the food it needs from the sources that it has, whether in Southeast Asia or South Asia or the Gulf or Africa. And so part of that, its concerns about the South China Sea are a reflection of that. Because if you have the United States as guarantor of security in the Pacific, then they must be concerned that the United States could use its naval power, which it has still significant advantage, to choke China off of some of the things that it needs. Now, many people say, well, look at the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road Initiative is a nefarious scheme for China to spread its influence and therefore, counter the United States in places like Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, in Africa, what have you. But and well, although China has had gained quite a bit of advantage, particularly in Africa, in terms of that. But again, a lot of it is driven by very important domestic concerns that China has. How will it maintain a high level of growth so that it maintains stability, so that it can continue to provide for its people? And a large part of that means we need to improve conditions in our neighborhood. We need to improve the capacity of other countries that we trade with in order that we can have a better relationship, more trade, more exchange, more commerce among these countries in order that we can source new growth, because China is getting old before it gets rich. And this is a big problem. You don't want China to suddenly hit the middle income trap, the Japan stagnancy problem, and they need to find new sources of growth. And the Belt and Road Initiative is a large part of that. So again,
bring Scott back into the conversation if you don't mind.
Can I just add one last thing?
Sure.
Specific to what you said, what can allies do? And I think this is very important, right? This gets to the nub of it. I think the approach really has to be, what can other countries do together, particularly middle powers, right? Now, the United States has been somewhat AWOL in all of this last 4 years because they don't want to play reindeer games with the so-called like-minded, right? Now, an issue here is that, I spent a lot of time when I was in the Canadian government talking to the British, talking to the Germans, talking to the Europeans, and indeed to Americans about, well, how do we work together to engage with China? And that's, I think, what we have to do. We have to also start thinking about essential multilateralism, areas where we need to kind of, I'm not saying forget about the contentious issues like human rights or what have you, but focus very much on where we need to cooperate because it's so essential for the world. And I would say that's climate change, that's pandemic, that's inequality, that's gender, that's human rights related to, say, human trafficking and modern day slavery, labor conditions and things like that. There are many, many areas, cybersecurity, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, all these areas of essential multilateralism where we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should try to focus, well, how can the rest of the world or a like-minded, I'm always worried about the use of the word like-minded, but where countries, including the United States, but maybe not always the United States, can come together and engage with China, particularly on such issues like the pandemic, like climate change.
Okay, well, let me bring Scott back in here and ask him to respond to some of what he's heard, but maybe with more of a focus on economics since we discussed the military issues earlier. So do you accept some of what Al has shared about China's essential interests and that perhaps a strategy that paid more attention to what the Chinese need in terms of their economic security and dealing with their social problems, combined with a more thoughtful approach to working with our partners in the region to engage China and more on not just the multilateral issues that we have an interest in, but also hopefully convincing it that since there's so many things we can work together for mutual benefit, that it's not worth driving a wedge between the United States and China by adopting such an assertive military policy.
Yeah, thanks, Len. And yeah, certainly a lot to react to. Obviously, we could probably have this discussion for more than an hour and a half. I think one of the kind of overarching themes I take from Al's last set of remarks, and then I'll turn to your specific question about cooperation prospects, is China, and this is important for your students, I think in particular, China is such a complicated and enormous phenomenon, if you will. These are real places with real people. Some of the real people are jerks. Some of the real people don't have enough time to explain how what they're trying to say is something you could probably live with, but they're pressed for time and they're saying it real quickly, and they're worried about your intents, and so therefore clashes emerge from a misunderstanding. But the broader question of could the United States cooperate with a China that is going in some of the directions that China is going right now? And I think first we have to start from the question, is it our job to try to consider as very important the goals and interests of China, or is it more our job to understand those, but really focus on our interests and our allies and partners' interests and values? I think, from most governments, and Al, you've served in government, you'd probably say, I guess, that probably most governments say, we need to know what the other folks are thinking about and prioritizing. But look, ultimately we were elected, if we were elected, or if we are not elected, we're going to go after our interests and values, and we will achieve those most effectively if we at least understand what the other side's equities are. So I think it's important to say, it's not the job of the United States or countries around the world to look out for China's interests or the equities that China needs or wants. It's important to understand those and to see where the overlap lies. And so here's where I would answer your question, Len. Many, many issues, well-meaning people can say, boy, doesn't it seem like we all have an interest? I mean, we've only got this one little blue, planet floating in space. It's probably the only place that we've ever been able to say definitively that there's life in the universe. Shouldn't we all be working to preserve it? We've got this pandemic raging. Shouldn't we all work together to defeat it? Proliferation of nuclear weapons. Isn't it bad for terrorists or North Korea or Iran to get a hold of those? Terrorism, isn't that something where we should cooperate? The challenge, I think, has been that China's approach in thinking about these issues and the US and its allies and partners' approaches to thinking about these issues tend to kind of exemplify what international relations scholars refer to as two different ways of thinking about gains. The United States and its allies and partners, when we are focused on the common threats to our shared humanity, are in the realm of focusing on absolute gains. In other words, we need to solve this problem. China's approach has often, I don't say always, but often been more focused on relative gains. If we solve this problem, does the United States gain more? Does Japan gain more? Does Europe gain more than China? And as a consequence, for example, if you say, well, global warming, we should definitely invest in new technologies like solar cell technology or wind turbine technology. Those are areas where China's strategy for achieving the kind of development that Al noted has lifted many millions of people out of poverty, but also made some of the people who are well connected to the Chinese government obscenely rich, has been to steal the intellectual property of countries like Japan, the United States, Germany, and Japan in the realm of high tech. And so there, an effort to try to get all of us moving towards greater, solar energy capture, perhaps reduction of carbon emissions from coal-fired thermal power plants. China with the Belt and Road Initiative right now is exporting a lot of coal-fired thermal power plants. That may make China look good at home, but it's causing more carbon to be put into the atmosphere abroad. With the pandemic, China's efforts to use mass diplomacy and to spread disinformation, blaming the United States Army as the possible source of the COVID-19 pandemic, and to argue that countries in Europe are actually not going to come to your rescue. So if you're Italy or you're Serbia, you should be grateful to China. That's another one where I'd say I think that the hope that you might see some kind of a cooperative outcome where we focus on our shared identity, our shared humanity, has been undermined. And the final one, counterproliferation. I think counterproliferation is one where the efforts to sanction North Korea to prevent Iran from getting the nuclear fuel cycle required the United States, in the case of Iran, to actually sanction Chinese firms. China didn't go along with it. In fact, the United States had to threaten through the use of SWIFT and the banking system and the shipping insurance systems to basically cut China off if it was going to continue to lift oil from Iran. And with North Korea, China has tried to slow down and prevent sanctions, weakly enforce them, and then smuggle around them. So with a number of the issues, which I agree, and I'm sure Al also would agree, are important areas where we should try to find areas to cooperate. Nonetheless, it has proven substantially more difficult, and that goes back even before the Trump administration to Democratic administrations. I think some of this just derives from the different ways that the United States and the Chinese Communist Party see their interests in the world. The United States is not likely to change China. The United States is not, that's something the Chinese people are going to do in one way or another, whether in a direction we like or a direction we don't like. And so the United States would be better, if it focuses its energy on speaking up for its interests, its security, and its values, and not premising much of its strategy for achieving the kinds of things it wants to see in the world: counterterrorism, counter-piracy, counter-proliferation, defeating the pandemic, countering global warming, not premise too much of that on a view of China that assumes that we can tell Beijing, look, this is actually good for you, you should do this, here's why we think it's in your interest, can't we cooperate, won't it be nice when this helps to limit or reduce the tensions in our relationship. I think the reality is we should tell Beijing, here's what we are going to do. We would like this from you. If we don't see it, that will continue to, that will shape our view one way. If we do see it, maybe we can build to a better relationship. I don't think that, especially with an incoming Biden administration, I don't think we're ever going to see the US say, full stop, we're not going to cooperate with you at all. We're going to treat you as an outright enemy or an adversary. I think what you will see is, a much more competitive strategy that is not premised on eliciting very much in the way of proactive Chinese contributions. And then if they show up, hey, great, maybe there's more, signaling here that the Chinese are actually willing to come meet us part of the way instead of waiting for us to satisfy them. That's what I would guess.
Thanks for summarizing your view nicely here at the end. Let me then turn to Al for the last word, responding to this kind of big question of how much should the U.S. focus on engagement to deal with these global problems that require cooperation versus signaling its vital interests and focusing on making sure China listens on those issues.
Well, I think the model is really on climate change, because I think when President Obama and President Xi came to some agreement on bilateral cooperation or bilateral exchange, or a kind of understanding on what the two countries could do and do together when it came to climate change, that really was what, how should I put it, was the catalyst for moving forward towards the Paris Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's the kind of a model, if you will, that we can maybe going forward, where we could potentially see some effort on other areas. I mean, particularly if the U.S. goes back to to the Paris Agreement, pandemic, on cybersecurity, even on the issue relating to, say, Chinese participation in a Chinese company like Huawei's participation in 5G. So if there is some talk and some agreement as to what is in both countries' interests in terms of solving some of these global issues, then they can be a catalyst for moving forward multilaterally in the wider international community. And I think that that's really the way forward. And so I mean, it's essentially what Scott was saying. But I do think, though, that the kind of rhetoric that we get about a Cold War, about China's being a threat and all of that, it isn't very helpful at this time. And yes, I think that President Biden, President-elect Biden, when he takes office, will certainly try to be as tough on China as he can possibly be, because he's looking years down for the next election, maybe not for him, but for the Democratic Party. But I do think that it will still be necessary to figure out a way forward, rather than to rely on this sort of Cold War rhetoric that will lead to, potentially could lead to the kind of hard wars that we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
China is globalization. You can't fight it. You can't decouple from it.
Thank you both. I am, sorry a bit that you ended up so emotional at one point, but I think it shows the stakes. It shows our students how high the stakes are in this debate about how the United States should respond to China, and what kind of choices the new Biden administration is going to have to make, because there are no easy ones. There are no obvious ones. And I heard both of you hedging towards each other several times in articulating your perspective. So I really appreciate your taking your time on this Monday morning.